Nashville, 1973. The Grand Ole Opry. A place where the wooden floors had absorbed a century of music, where every corridor smelled like rosin and old leather, and something that could only be called history. The backstage halls were narrow, lit by humming fluorescent tubes, crowded with people who had been doing this long enough that they barely noticed the music anymore. Roy Acuff was 70 years old that fall. He had been called the king of country music for so long that most people assumed the title was simply attached to him permanently, like a birthmark. He had played this stage hundreds of times. He had watched every wave of new music crash against Nashville's walls and dissolve. He had outlasted all of it. He was standing near the wardrobe room with a cup of coffee, watching the new act load their equipment. Five men from Jacksonville, Florida, worn boots, jeans that hadn't been bought new in a while, t-shirts that weren't trying to communicate anything in particular. Their gear looked like it had survived more than one bad road. Their name was printed on the bass drum. Something nobody backstage seemed sure how to say out loud. Two stagehands had already attempted it and quietly moved on. Roy watched them for a moment. Then he watched their singer more carefully than the rest. Ronnie Van Zant was 25. Not tall, not the kind of presence that fills a room just by walking into it, not yet. He had a face that looked like it had spent most of its years outdoors. He was directing the equipment setup with a quiet, unpretentious authority. Not the authority of someone who had declared himself the boss, but of someone who simply was. Roy set down his coffee. What he said next wasn't cruel. That's worth understanding before we go any further. He wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. He was a man who had spent 7 decades in music and had developed genuine, hard-won opinions about what singing was and what it wasn't, and he expressed those opinions the way men of his generation tended to, directly, without much thought for how they might land. He looked at Ronnie and said it plainly. He'd heard the record. He'd heard what people were calling Southern rock. Good energy, he allowed. Crowds responded to it. But singing, real singing, the kind that requires breath control, pitch management, years of learned technique. He wasn't convinced that was what he was hearing. He asked it almost casually, the way you'd comment on the weather. Could Ronnie Van Zant actually sing, or did he just know how to be loud? The backstage corridor went quiet in the specific way places go quiet when something important is about to happen, and everyone in the room senses it before it does. Ronnie didn't look angry. He looked at Roy Acuff for a moment, the way you look at a map when you're trying to orient yourself, just taking in information. Then he asked one question. What's your favorite song to sing? If you've never seen someone defuse a provocation by walking straight toward it instead of away from it, you're about to understand what that looks like. Subscribe and stay with this story, and drop a comment below about the moment someone underestimated what you were actually carrying. Roy told him. Wabash Cannonball. He had sung it 1,000 times, recorded it, performed it on this stage in front of presidents and governors, and a radio audience that stretched from one end of the country to the other. It was his in the way few things are truly yours after you've given them to the public. Ronnie nodded once. Can someone find me an acoustic guitar? That question produced a silence of a different kind. Not the tense kind from before. The kind that happens when a room full of experienced people realizes they have no idea what they're about to see. A production assistant disappeared and came back with a battered Martin D28. Ronnie took it without ceremony, didn't inspect it or make a production of the process. He sat down on a road case, placed the guitar in his lap, and began tuning it by ear. Quickly, efficiently. No wasted motion, no performance of preparation. When he was satisfied, he looked up at Roy Acuff. This song, he said, you wrote it the way it should be sung, so I'm going to sing it the way you wrote it. Then he started. The first thing that hit everyone in that corridor was the control, not volume. Ronnie wasn't singing loud. He was singing at the kind of moderate, effortless volume that actually requires more discipline than screaming, because you can't hide behind force. Every pitch has to be exact. Every breath has to be planned. The melody of Wabash Cannonball is deceptively simple, which is exactly why it exposes a voice that isn't what it claims to be. There's nowhere to hide. You either have it or you don't. Ronnie had it. Roy Acuff stood completely still. His coffee cup was in his hand, but he'd stopped drinking from it. He was listening the way musicians listen when something real is happening. Not evaluating, not comparing, just receiving. His expression hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted. What Ronnie was doing wasn't imitation. He wasn't mimicking Roy's phrasing or borrowing his delivery. He was doing something rarer and harder than that. He was honoring the architecture of the song, the way the melody was built, the spaces it left open for breath, the specific weight that certain notes were supposed to carry, and he was doing it with absolute fidelity to the original intent. Not because he lacked his own voice, because he understood that a great song has a shape, and respecting that shape isn't limitation. It's comprehension. By the second verse, two of the stagehands had stopped working. They weren't watching exactly. They were just standing there, the way you stand when something catches your attention so completely that you forget you're supposed to be somewhere else. Roy set his coffee cup down on a nearby equipment case, very quietly. He did not look away from the stage. And then Ronnie did the thing. He didn't announce it. He didn't pause for effect. At the end of the last chorus of Wabash Cannonball, instead of stopping, his left hand shifted the chord voicing, and the emotional register of the guitar changed entirely. What came next was not Roy Acuff's song. It was his own. The opening chords of Simple Man. For people who know both pieces of music, the transition was something to stop and stare at. Not because of any technical difficulty, but because of what it revealed. Ronnie had just shown, in real time, that he could inhabit someone else's musical world with complete fluency, and then walk straight out the other side into something entirely his own without breaking stride. Two different traditions, two entirely different emotional registers, one uninterrupted musical statement, Simple Man, stripped down to a single acoustic guitar in a fluorescent-lit backstage hallway, was a different thing entirely from what it sounded like on a record. Without the full band, without the production, without anything standing between the song and the room, every word landed with a different kind of weight. The lyric is a mother talking to her son. Take your time. Don't live too fast. Be a simple man. It is not a complicated sentiment, but the way Ronnie delivered it in that hallway, at that volume, in that stripped-down form, it stopped being a lyric and became something closer to a fact about the world. Roy Acuff's hands were shaking slightly. When Ronnie stopped, it wasn't because the song was over in any formal sense. He stopped because he had said what he needed to say. He let the last chord ring until it didn't anymore, then set the guitar carefully on the road case beside him and looked up. Roy stood there for a long moment. Then he walked toward Ronnie with the measured, deliberate movement of a man who is working through something internally. He stopped directly in front of him. He didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than anyone in that corridor had probably ever heard it. "I've been singing since I was 10 years old," Roy said. "I've heard voices that could shake a church and voices that could make a grown man cry on a Tuesday afternoon with no good reason he could name. I thought I understood what a voice was and what it wasn't." He stopped for a moment. "I was wrong about you." He didn't say it as an apology. He said it as a statement of fact. The way a man who has spent his entire life in honest assessment delivers honest assessment when it's required of him. What happened next is the part of this story that only the people in that corridor carried with them. Roy Acuff sat down on the road case next to Ronnie Van Zant, and for the next 20 minutes they talked. Not about Southern rock or country music or the politics of Nashville. They talked about singing, what it actually was, technically and emotionally, about breath and weight and the difference between a note that lands and a note that merely arrives. People who were there later described it as the strangest and most ordinary thing they'd ever witnessed backstage. Two men from entirely different worlds who had just discovered they were speaking the same language. That moment in the Grand Ole Opry corridor in 1973 didn't make it into any newspaper. Nobody filmed it. Road stories like this travel person to person for years before they become part of any record, and some of them never fully do. What is documented is what Roy Acuff said about Ronnie Van Zant in the years that followed. He called him, more than once and in various conversations, the most honest vocal talent he had encountered in the modern era. He said specifically that what Ronnie had was not a trained voice in the conventional sense, but something arguably rarer, a voice that couldn't lie. He meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. On October 20th, 1977, a plane went down in a Mississippi swamp. Ronnie Van Zant was 29 years old. Roy Acuff was 74. He outlived Ronnie by 15 years. People who knew Roy well said he kept a copy of the band's second album in his dressing room at the Opry for years after the crash. Not displayed prominently, just there, on a shelf, the way you keep things that have weight. He never made a formal public statement about the loss. What he said in the months after was quieter than that. In private conversations, in dressing rooms, and at dinner tables, and in the kinds of informal moments that don't get recorded, but sometimes get remembered. He said that Nashville had never fully understood what had come out of Jacksonville, that they had confused roughness with ignorance and volume with lack of control, and that none of those assumptions had been accurate or fair. He said Ronnie Van Zant understood singing the way very few people in any generation understand it. Not from a textbook, not from a conservatory, but from the inside. The band from Jacksonville went on to become one of the most enduring acts in American music. Their songs are still playing on radio stations, at stadiums, in living rooms. The voice that Roy Acuff heard in that backstage hallway, the one he said could not lie, is still, 50 years later, doing exactly that. Not lying, just singing what is true. And somewhere in Nashville, the story of that acoustic guitar, that corridor, those 20 minutes, it became the kind of story that the people who were there don't tell cheaply. They wait for the right moment. They tell it once carefully. Then they let it sit. Some things deserve that kind of quiet. Some stories earn the right to travel slowly. If this story found you today, subscribe and tell us in the comments about a moment in your own life when you let the work answer a question that words never could. Write it below. That's the only response that ever really counts.